The late afternoon light drifted through the tall windows of his London home, falling in muted streaks of gold across the wooden floor. At 81, Ian McKellen sat quietly in an armchair near the fireplace, wrapped not in a blanket, but in the gentle weight of memory. Outside, the winter rain tapped softly against the glass, as if echoing a rhythm he had long carried inside himself. He lifted a hand slowly, tracing the rim of a teacup with a distant look. The look of a man who had lived many lives on stage, yet kept the most fragile parts of his real life behind a locked door. His voice, when it finally emerged, was low, steady, and touched with something ancient. "There are 5 people," he murmured, "whom I will never forgive. No anger, no theatrics, just a truth spoken like a final confession." Ian McKellen, the titan of Shakespeare, the sorcerer of Middle-earth, the warrior of cinema, was not speaking as an icon now, but as a man who had learned that even the strongest hearts bruise deepest. His fame had taken him across continents, onto stages bathed in blinding light. Yet it was in the dim quiet of this room that he chose to reveal the shadows he had never named. He folded his hands together, eyes fixed on the soft tremble of the fire. "Some wounds," he whispered, "do not close. They simply grow silent. 5 faces, 5 stories buried beneath decades of brilliance. And somewhere among them, though he would not admit it yet, was a betrayal far more intimate than the rest." But who were these people? And why, after 81 years, did their names still echo inside him? Long before the ovations, long before the world called him a legend, Ian McKellen was a quiet boy growing up in the shadowed north of England, in a household where love existed, but seldom spoke. Born in Burnley during the final years of the war, he grew up listening to the distant wail of sirens, the hush of rationing, and the quiet determination of a country piecing itself back together. His childhood was shaped less by noise and more by absence. The absence of certainty, of ease, of emotional warmth freely given. His parents, Dennis and Marjorie, were gentle souls but belonged to a generation defined by restraint. Affection, though real, was folded neatly beneath layers of British composure. Ian learned early that feelings were things to be navigated silently, tucked away like fragile objects. He remembers the way his father smiled, kindly but always from a distance, and how his mother's softness seemed at times overshadowed by the weight of unspoken worry. Tragedy struck before he understood how to name it. His mother died when he was just 12, leaving behind a silence so heavy it settled into the very walls of their home. In that quiet grief, Ian discovered the strange ache of being young and suddenly older, of wanting to cry, but learning instead to endure. His father remarried kindly, but the wound had already carved itself deep. School offered no refuge. He was bright, thoughtful, different, qualities that often drew unwanted attention. Yet even in that loneliness, he found glimmers of something extraordinary. In the dimly lit halls of school theaters, amid dusty costumes and flickering lamps, he discovered a strange freedom. Acting allowed him to feel without punishment, to inhabit emotions too large for the real world to hold. But the origins of his gift were tangled with the origins of his pain. The early loss of his mother, the emotional distance of his father, the quiet isolation of northern England, all of it shaped him. Not into the giant of theater he would one day become, but into a boy who learned to carry grief with elegance. And it was this quiet carrying, this lifelong habit of holding more than he ever said, that would later draw him toward the very betrayals he would never be able to forgive. Ian McKellen's rise was not a sudden blaze, but a slow, deliberate awakening, the unfolding of a young man who had spent years living quietly inside himself. When he arrived at Cambridge, he was not the confident prodigy one might imagine. He was reserved, thoughtful, carrying the elegance of someone who had learned to observe before speaking. Yet beneath that gentleness, there was something else, an ember of intensity waiting for the right moment to ignite. It was in the student theater societies, rooms that smelled of dust, paint, and possibility, that he found the stage becoming the first place where he felt entirely seen. Acting did not simply offer expression, it offered something far more precious: permission. Permission to be loud, to be vulnerable, to be furious, to be magnificent. Every role he touched seemed to peel away another layer of the young man who had been taught his whole life to remain quiet. After Cambridge, the theater claimed him fully. McKellen moved from stage to stage with a discipline that bordered on devotion. He studied scripts the way others study scripture, meticulously, reverently, searching for hidden truths between lines. When he stepped under the stage lights, something transformative happened. His voice deepened, his presence expanded, and the audience felt a force that defied the modesty of the man behind it. Then came the turning point, his Shakespearean triumphs. Richard II, Macbeth, Coriolanus. His performances were not simply celebrated, they were inhabited. He breathed life into words 4 centuries old, offering vulnerability where others offered rage, offering intelligence where others offered volume. The critics called him astonishing, mythic, dangerous in his honesty, but the truth was simpler and far more human. Ian McKellen was not performing kings. He was revealing the quiet storms he had carried since childhood. Film followed, though it arrived later for him than for most. His early roles were elegant, precise, but it wasn't until Gods and Monsters that Hollywood finally understood the gravity he carried. And when X-Men and The Lord of the Rings catapulted him into global recognition, he wore that fame with the grace of someone who had already survived real battles long before celebrity found him. Yet even as his star rose, the fractures inside him grew more pronounced. Success illuminated the cracks he had kept hidden. Love grew complicated. Friendships shifted under the pressure of fame. And the past, those quiet wounds from boyhood, continued to echo. Ian McKellen's rise was magnificent, but it carried within it the seeds of the betrayals that would one day leave scars he could never forgive. The ruptures in Ian McKellen's life did not come as public scandals or explosive confrontations. They emerged quietly, the way fractures spread through old stone. Slowly, invisibly, until one day the structure shifts under its own weight. For a man who had learned to endure in silence, these ruptures arrived with a different kind of violence, the violence of things unspoken. The first rupture came not from a stranger, but from someone he admired deeply, a figure in the theater world whose brilliance Ian looked up to as a young actor. This mentor offered guidance, opportunity, and encouragement, but beneath the surface there was another layer, manipulation, praise that arrived with threads attached, approval that demanded conformity, support that dissolved the moment Ian stepped outside the lines drawn for him. It's painful, he would later say, to realize someone you trusted only supported the version of you that served them. The second rupture came from friendship, the kind built slowly, over rehearsals, shared meals, and the quiet loyalty of creative camaraderie. But fame reshapes relationships, often cruelly. As Ian's star rose, jealousy crept into places where affection once lived. A friend he believed would walk with him through decades began instead to resent him in silence. That resentment eventually surfaced as betrayal, not loud, but sharp enough to cut. Then came love, and with it, the third rupture. Ian never loved lightly. He loved with generosity, with attentiveness, with a softness rare in a world that demanded grandeur from him. But one relationship in particular left him undone. A partner he trusted, someone who knew his vulnerabilities intimately, used those very vulnerabilities against him during moments of anger. Words became weapons. Affection became strategy. And when the relationship ended, it left behind a kind of wound that does not bleed, but lingers. The fourth rupture arrived later, when he least expected it, a fracture within family. A misunderstanding that grew into distance, distance into silence, and silence into a sorrow that became part of him. These ruptures did not destroy him, but they carved into him the spaces where the 5 unforgivable names would one day take root. When Ian McKellen, at 81, finally agreed to speak of the 5 people he will never forgive, he did so not with anger, but with a kind of weary clarity. His voice did not rise. His hands did not tremble. The weight of these names had lived inside him for decades, and now, as he sat in the soft amber glow of a fading afternoon, he simply let them surface. Forgiveness, he murmured, is something I've given freely all my life, except to these five. And so he began. The mentor who dimmed his light. In his early 20s, Ian admired him with the devotion of a young actor seeking purpose. This mentor's voice shaped his confidence, his choices, even his understanding of what greatness meant. But admiration often blinds, and Ian did not see the manipulation woven through every compliment. This mentor pushed him, but never lifted him, praised him, but only when it served his own reputation, encouraged him, then quietly undermined him. It took Ian years to see that he had been sculpted not to grow, but to serve someone else's ambition. I don't hate him, Ian said softly. I simply cannot forgive the man who taught me to doubt my own brilliance. The friend who carried envy like a shadow. There was a friend, bright, witty, inseparable from Ian for years. They shared dressing rooms, train rides, cheap meals after late rehearsals. But when Ian's name began rising faster, that friendship shifted. Envy arrived quietly, disguised as playful jabs, subtle distance, then sharper remarks that landed like cuts. One day Ian learned this friend had spoken ill of him while pretending loyalty in his presence. It was jealousy, he said, but it disguised itself as affection for far too long. The betrayal was not loud, and that was exactly why it stung. The love who broke him without meaning to Ian loved late, deeply, tenderly, cautiously. But this relationship, the one he believed might carry him into old age, slowly unraveled, not because of abuse or scandal or cruelty, but because of something far more painful, a love that could not hold its own weight. The man he loved drifted away piece by piece. Conversations shortened, affection cooled, shared laughter grew rare. And then one day, without malice, he simply asked for space and never returned. I could forgive heartbreak, Ian said, but I could never forgive being left without a reason. Some absences, he added, are louder than words. The colleague who used his vulnerabilities against him later in life, Ian allowed himself to trust again, this time in the professional sphere. He confided in a colleague during a film production, sharing fears, doubts, and memories he had never voiced publicly. He believed it was friendship. It was, in truth, collection, a gathering of weaknesses to be used at the right moment. During a dispute on set, that colleague revealed Ian's confidences in front of others, twisting private vulnerability into public humiliation. It was a betrayal so calculated, so cold, that Ian felt something in him close permanently. I forgave mistakes, he whispered, but I could never forgive cruelty dressed as honesty. Himself, the one he struggles most to face. The final name came after a long silence. Ian stared at the fire for several moments before speaking. The fifth person, he said, is me. Not the actor, not the knight, not the legend, but the man who stayed silent when he should have spoken, who hid pieces of himself for decades out of fear, who let opportunities pass because he believed he wasn't ready, who closed doors in the name of caution, who punished himself with doubt far more than any critic ever could. I lived half my life as a ghost in my own story, he confessed. I cannot forgive the version of myself who thought he deserved so little. Yet even as he admitted this, his voice softened, not into forgiveness, but into recognition. An understanding that the deepest wounds are often self-inflicted, and the hardest person to face is the one who greets you in the mirror. These five people shaped Ian McKellen, not through kindness, but through fracture. But in speaking their names, he is not reopening wounds. He is acknowledging the map of scars that led him to the man he is today. The man who endures, the man who rises, the man who finally, at 81, tells the truth without trembling. At 81, Ian McKellen lives his days with a gentleness that feels almost like a second language, one he spent a lifetime learning. His home, tucked away behind old stone walls and soft English gardens, carries the hush of a man who no longer needs to prove anything. In the quiet hours of the evening, when the twilight folds into the room in pale amber tones, he often sits by the window with a cup of tea, letting the world slow to his pace. He has outlived stages, outlived storms, outlived versions of himself he once thought permanent. And now in the late chapters of his life, He speaks of the 5 people he can never forgive, not with bitterness, but with clarity. They shaped him, wounded him, sharpened him. They carved into him the strength he did not know he possessed. The older I get, he says, the more I understand that forgiveness is not a gift for others. It is a kindness for one's own heart. The 4 from his past, the mentor, the friend, the lover, the colleague, have become shadows. Their impact is real, but their power has thinned. He no longer carries them. He simply remembers. But the 5th, the version of himself he could never fully embrace, is now someone he is learning to greet with a softer gaze. Age has given him what youth denied, the permission to be imperfect, to be complicated, to be human. He does not seek closure. He seeks understanding. And as the firelight flickers across the lines on his face, we are left to wonder, what becomes of a lifetime when its wounds are finally named? And who might we become when we stop fearing the ghosts of our own past